Hi guys, today we are going to discuss a subject that sits right at the crossroads of archaeology, ancient history, and one of the deepest mysteries humanity has ever preserved in clay and stone. This is the story of the Sumerians, the first civilization, and the strange, unsettling, and endlessly fascinating accounts they left behind about weapons of the gods, not poetic thunderbolts, not vague divine power, but weapons with names, functions, procedures, and terrifying effects. Weapons that fly, that speak, that act on their own. Weapons that melt stone, poison land, darken skies, and erase cities. Tonight, we are going to begin a long journey through those ancient texts, slowly and carefully letting the tablets speak for themselves. For thousands of years, these stories were silent. The clay tablets lay buried beneath sand and ruined cities. No one could read them. Their wedge-shaped writing, called cuneiform, was meaningless to the modern world. Kings rose and fell, empires came and went, and the voices of the first civilization were locked inside clay. When European explorers and archaeologists began uncovering these tablets in the 1800s, they had no idea what they were holding. They looked like strange bricks covered in scratches. But once the script was finally deciphered, a lost world came back to life. That world was Sumer. Sumer was not just another ancient kingdom. It was the first place on Earth where humans built true cities. Not villages, not tribes, cities with walls, temples, laws, written records, and bureaucracies. Around 3500 BCE, in the flat lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians created Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur. They invented writing to track grain and livestock. They developed mathematics to measure land. They created astronomy to track the sky. They built massive stepped temples called ziggurats that dominated the horizon. They even wrote down their prayers, their myths, their history, and their fears. And what they feared most was not just famine or flood. They feared the weapons of the gods. The Sumerians believed their world was ruled by powerful beings called the Anunnaki. These were not distant, abstract spirits. In the tablets, they behave like rulers. They meet in councils. They argue. They issue decrees. They command armies. They own weapons. And when they go to war, the land itself suffers. One of the oldest and most important tablets ever discovered is called the Eridu Genesis. It sits today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalog number CBS 10673. It is damaged, broken, missing large sections, but what remains is astonishing. It tells of a time before the Great Flood, when cities existed, kings ruled, and gods watched over the world. It also hints at something far darker. It places descriptions of divine councils and destruction alongside references to powerful weapons. Not metaphors, not poetry, weapons. To understand why this matters, we need to understand how Sumerian writing works. Sumerian scribes did not write vague stories the way we do today. They wrote with the same precision they used to record trade, laws, and engineering. When they listed grain shipments, they used exact numbers. When they described temple inventories, they listed objects and where they were stored. And when they described the weapons of the gods, they used that same methodical style. The word they used most often for weapon was tukul. On the surface, it can mean something simple like a mace or a club, but when we read the texts, tukul is something very different. The tablets describe tukul that fly, tukul that speak, tukul that burn cities, tukul that act without a human hand guiding them. These are not Bronze Age clubs. One of the most famous examples comes from a long Sumerian epic called Lugal-e, also known as Ninurta's exploits. Ninurta was the warrior god, the champion of the Anunnaki. When the gods needed a problem solved by force, Ninurta was sent. And Ninurta did not go into battle alone. He had weapons. One of them was called Shar-ur, often translated as King Smiter or Royal Hunter. But the text does not describe Shar-Ur as something Ninurta simply holds in his hand. Shar-Ur moves on its own. It flies, it travels long distances, it reports back to Ninurta. In one tablet, Shar-Ur is sent to the god Enlil to deliver a message. The weapon arrives, speaks, and explains the situation on the battlefield. It then returns to Ninurta with Enlil's response, a weapon that travels independently, a weapon that speaks, a weapon that gathers information. A weapon that returns with orders. The tablets treat this as normal. Another weapon of Ninurta was called Shar-Gaz, the Royal Smiter. It is described as moving ahead of him in battle, striking enemies before Ninurta even arrives. The texts say it knows its path and requires no hand to guide it. That phrase appears again and again, no hand to guide it. The Sumerians knew what handheld weapons were. They had spears, axes, and slings. They knew that those weapons require a person to use them. But these divine weapons did not. They acted on their own, and Ninurta was not the only god with such weapons. In the Babylonian version of Sumerian traditions, we meet the god Marduk. In the epic Enuma Elish, Marduk fights the primordial goddess Tiamat, a being of chaos. Before the battle, Marduk assembles an arsenal. The tablets list his weapons. He takes winds, he takes nets, he takes lightning arrows. He takes something called the Imhulu, the evil wind. These are not described as weather, they are described as deployable tools. Marduk positions them, he releases them, he uses them tactically. When he fights Tiamat, he does not simply overpower her. He traps her with a net. He fills her with wind so she cannot move. Then he fires a brilliant weapon that splits her body. The language reads like a combat report, not a fairy tale. Another group of weapons appears in the Epic of Erra, the god of destruction and plague. Erra commands 7 beings called the Sebitu, the Seven. These are not just helpers, they are weapons. They are described as moving together, coordinating their actions, and devastating entire lands. They bring darkness, disease, fire, and ruin. They are deployed like a strike force. The texts even describe how they communicate. They know each other's positions. They act as one. They do not need to speak. And then there is the most disturbing story of all, the flood. The flood in Sumerian texts is not just a rainstorm, it is a decision. The gods meet. They complain that humans are too many, too loud, too disruptive. They try plagues, they try famine, they try drought. When those fail, Enlil decides to unleash the flood, and the tablets describe how it happens. They say the bolts were drawn back, the locks were opened. The waters above and below were released. This is not poetic rain. This is something sealed being opened, something held back being let loose. Even the gods are terrified by what they release. They watch the destruction in horror. They did not expect it to be so powerful. Afterward, they swear never to do it again. These stories repeat across hundreds of tablets, copied in different cities in different centuries by different scribes, and yet the details stay the same. The same weapons, the same functions, the same names, the same terrifying effects. Temples stored these weapons. We know this from inventory tablets. They list the weapons of the gods kept in sealed chambers. They describe wrapping them in cloth, locking them behind doors, inspecting them on specific days. They even describe accidents where priests died after mishandling them. And beneath those temples, archaeologists have found strange rooms, underground chambers lined with copper and lead, thick walls, sealed doors, ventilation shafts. These are not ordinary storerooms. What were they built to hold? Mainstream scholars say all of this is symbolic. They say it is metaphor, they say it is mythology. Storms became weapons, disease became demons, political power became divine tools, and in many ways they are right. Ancient people used symbolic language to understand the world, but here is the question that will drive this entire series. Why is the symbolism so technical? Why do the gods have weapons that act autonomously? Why do these weapons require storage, maintenance, and safety procedures? Why do they produce effects that sound disturbingly like radiation, chemical exposure, and directed energy? Why do the tablets describe command systems, authorization, and control? Why does stealing the tablet of destinies cause all divine systems to fail? Why does killing Humbaba require disabling his 7 terrors with specific countermeasures? These are not the questions of fantasy. They are the questions of systems, and in the clay of ancient Sumer, those systems were written down. The Sumerians called it the Tablet of Destinies, but that name can be misleading. To modern ears, it sounds mystical, like a magical book that decides fate. But in the cuneiform tablets, the word translated as destiny really means something closer to authority, decree, or operational command. The one who holds the tablet does not simply predict the future. He decides what will happen. He issues commands that must be obeyed. He controls the structure of reality, including the weapons of the gods. The story of this tablet appears in one of the most dramatic myths ever written, the tale of Anzu. Anzu was not a god in the same way Enlil or Ninurta were. He was a powerful, eagle-like being, a servant, a guardian. Enlil trusted him. Anzu guarded the chamber where the Tablet of Destinies was kept. This chamber was not a symbolic space. It was described as restricted, sealed, and protected. Only those with authority were allowed near the tablet. One day, while Enlil was bathing, Anzu did something that changed everything. He took the Tablet of Destinies and fled. The effect was immediate. The tablets tell us that when Anzu seized the Tablet of Destinies, the divine order collapsed. The gods became powerless. Their offices ceased to function. Their commands no longer had effect. Their weapons could not be deployed. Even the radiance of divinity faded. This is crucial. The Tablet of Destinies is not just a symbol of leadership, it is a control system. It links the gods to their power and to their weapons. Without it, they cannot act. With it, Anzu could. The gods gathered in emergency council. Panic filled the divine assembly. Enlil demanded that someone retrieve the tablet, but the gods refused. One by one, they said the same thing. Anzu holds the Tablet of Destinies. He can decree our fate. If we approach him, he will command our own weapons to destroy us. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is a description of a compromised command system. Whoever holds the tablet can issue commands to the divine weapons. That means attacking Anzu with those weapons is impossible. They will obey him, not their original masters. So the gods face a tactical nightmare. Their most powerful tools are useless. Only Ninurta, the warrior god, agrees to try. He goes to confront Anzu. First, Ninurta tries to use his divine weapons. He releases them. But Anzu simply commands them to stop. The tablets say that Ninurta's weapons fell uselessly. Arrows turned back, attacks failed. The weapons no longer obeyed Ninurta. Anzu had taken control, so Ninurta retreats. He seeks advice from E, the god of wisdom. E tells him something very important. You cannot fight Anzu with weapons he can control. You must strike him before he can speak. You must prevent him from issuing commands. You must attack with your own hands, not with autonomous weapons. This is an extraordinary piece of tactical advice. It assumes the Tablet of Destinies transmits commands through speech or some form of communication. If Anzu cannot speak, he cannot issue commands. If he cannot issue commands, the weapons cannot be activated. Ninurta waits for a storm. When the winds rise and the air is full of noise, he attacks. The storm drowns out Anzu's voice. In that moment, Ninurta strikes, cripples Anzu, and seizes the tablet. The moment Ninurta takes the Tablet of Destinies, everything changes. The divine order is restored. The gods regain their power. The weapons become obedient again. The system reboots. This is not a fairy tale. This is a description of command and control. A central device governs distributed systems. When the device is stolen, everything fails. When it is recovered, everything works again. The Tablet of Destinies appears again and again in Sumerian and Babylonian literature. It is always the same, it is always physical, it is always guarded, it always confers control. And it is not just about gods. Kings claim to possess it, temple inventories reference it, rituals protect it. It is part of the system that holds the world together. Now let us connect this to something even more disturbing. The weapons. We already saw that Ninurta's weapons, like Shar act on their own. They fly, they speak, they execute missions. But they do not act without authorization. They require command. They require me, the Sumerian term for divine power, order, and function. And the Tablet of Destinies is the ultimate source of that me. Without it, weapons are inert. With it, they become unstoppable. This explains something critical about the flood. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods debate humanity's fate. They authorize the flood. Enlil gives the command. The locks are opened. The waters are released. But Enki cannot stop it. He can only warn Atrahasis to build a boat. Why? Because once the flood weapon is authorized, it cannot be cancelled. Just like Ninurta could not stop his weapons when Anzu had the tablet, just like Marduk's winds cannot be recalled once released, just like the Sebetu must finish their mission once deployed. These are fire and forget systems, autonomous, irreversible. The gods themselves fear them. This fear is written into the tablets. The gods huddle in terror as the flood rages. They regret their decision. They realize they unleashed something beyond their control. After the flood, they swear never to do it again, and temples begin performing rituals not to summon the flood but to prevent it, to keep the locks closed, to keep the system from activating. This is not how people behave toward symbolic myths. This is how people behave toward dangerous power. When we move from the Tablet of Destinies to the Seven, we move from the idea of control to the reality of execution. The Seven, called the Sebetu in Akkadian and simply the Seven in many tablets, are not gods in the ordinary sense. They are described as created things, built, assigned, positioned, deployed. They are not born, they are made. In the Epic of Erra, one of the most unsettling texts ever written in ancient Mesopotamia, we are told exactly how they came into being. Anu, the sky god, looks down upon humanity and sees a problem. There are too many people. Their cities are loud. Their activity disturbs the divine order. He decides a correction is needed, but instead of sending storms or plagues, he creates something new. The text uses the verb banu, which means to build or to construct. Anu builds the Seven. He stations them before the divine assembly like weapons on a rack. They are not advisors. They are not servants. They are tools of destruction waiting for authorization. Each of the Seven has a specific role. One strikes the front. One strikes the flanks. One strikes from above. One strikes from below. One brings darkness. One brings poisonous wind, one brings withering fire. This is not poetic flourish. It is a tactical layout, a target surrounded in all dimensions. Physical destruction, visual blackout, respiratory attack, and environmental damage all applied together. When Erra decides to unleash them, the tablets describe how they are positioned around the land. They do not charge like soldiers, they deploy, they spread out. They establish coverage, they operate together, described as one mind in 7 bodies. The 7 do not need to be told what to do once released. They know, they communicate without speaking. They coordinate without messengers. Where they pass, cities collapse. Where they linger, land becomes barren. Survivors flee, and generations later the place is still avoided. This detail matters. Ancient war devastates cities, but people return. Crops grow again. The soil recovers. But the texts say some areas struck by the seven remain empty long afterward. They are described as cursed, poisoned, dead, and this idea appears outside of myth. There are Mesopotamian boundary stones warning that certain lands must not be entered because they are under the power of divine destruction. There are medical texts describing illnesses that appear after exposure to something called IM letter 1E2BULLU, the same evil wind used by Marduk and Erra. These illnesses include bleeding, weakness, skin damage, and slow death. These are not the effects of swords, they are the effects of contamination. The seven appear again in ritual texts, not as beings to be worshipped but as threats to be restrained. Priests perform ceremonies to keep the seven asleep, to bind them, to keep them from waking. 7 offerings at 7 gates, 7 prayers at 7 points, 7 days of ritual. This is not mythology, this is containment culture. The Sumerians and Babylonians did not think the seven were gone. They thought they were dormant, sleeping, waiting, and now we come to something even more chilling. The places where the seven were said to sleep were real places. Under certain temples, archaeologists have found deep chambers, rooms with thick walls, metal linings, ventilation systems, sealed access. These chambers were empty when discovered, but the tablets say they once held divine weapons. If the seven were purely symbolic, why build physical vaults for them? Why line walls with lead and copper? Why prescribe inspection, sealing, and quarantine procedures? One Assyrian text records a disaster. Priests opened a weapon chamber without proper rituals. 7 of them died within days, others became sick for months. The weapon was sealed again for a full year. This is not superstition. This is an incident report. Something dangerous was released. Something harmful spread. And it took time to fade. We will enter the cedar forest. We will meet Humbaba. And we will see how even human heroes were forced to use divine countermeasures to survive what lay inside. The Epic of Gilgamesh is usually read as a story about friendship and the search for immortality, but buried inside it is one of the strangest military encounters ever recorded in ancient literature. Gilgamesh and Enkidu do not simply wander into the cedar forest and fight a monster. They breach a protected zone, they trigger a defensive system, and they survive only because a higher authority intervenes with superior countermeasures. The cedar forest was not just a forest, it was a strategic resource. It supplied the great temples and cities of Mesopotamia with wood, something extremely rare in the river plains of Sumer. The gods did not leave it unguarded. Enlil assigned a guardian to it. His name was Humbaba. The tablets do not describe Humbaba as a wild beast. They describe him as an installed guardian. He is placed there. He is given authority, and he is equipped with 7 terrifying powers called the Melamu. The word Melamu is usually translated as radiance or divine terror, but in this text it functions as a weapon system. Humbaba's Melamu are deployed, not merely felt. They are released, they strike, they incapacitate. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu reach the forest gate, they find something strange. There is a door, but no visible lock. They cannot open it. Enkidu warns Gilgamesh that the gate is dangerous, that it can harm anyone who touches it without authorization. This sounds like a security system, not a wooden door. When they force their way inside, they begin cutting trees. Immediately, Humbaba detects them. The tablets say he hears them from far away. He knows what they are doing. He turns toward the sound and advances. This is remote sensing. Then Humbaba releases his Melamu. The first Melamu freezes Gilgamesh in place. The second drains Enkidu's strength. The third darkens the air. The fourth shakes the ground. The fifth poisons their breath. The sixth scrambles their minds. The seventh induces a deadly sleep. These are not symbolic fears. These are layered defensive effects: mobility denial, energy drain, visual disruption, structural destabilization, chemical attack, psychological warfare, lethal incapacitation. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are overwhelmed. They cannot fight back, and then something extraordinary happens. The sun god Shamash intervenes, but he does not simply strike Humbaba with lightning. He deploys 13 winds. Each wind is described with a specific function. One clears darkness, one lifts the net, one dispels poison, one stabilizes the ground, one breaks pressure, one restores clarity. Together they counter every Melamu Humbaba has. The winds surround Humbaba. He cannot move, he cannot see, he cannot release his terrors. His weapon systems are neutralized. Only then do Gilgamesh and Enkidu attack him physically. This is a tactical operation, a protected installation, an automated guardian, layered defenses, electronic or environmental countermeasures, then a direct strike. After Humbaba is defeated, something even more telling happens. Gilgamesh and Enkidu take his Melamu. They do not just kill him, they remove his 7 powers, they take them away. They are portable, and Enlil is furious, not because a monster was slain, but because a defense system was dismantled. You have taken what was not yours to take, Enlil says. You have removed what guarded a sacred place. This is not moral outrage, this is security breach. And Enlil demands punishment because something dangerous is now loose in the world. And so we return to the flood. But now, with everything we have seen, the flood no longer looks like a simple act of divine anger. It looks like the most powerful weapon the gods possessed. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods do not unleash the flood impulsively. They argue, they debate, they try lesser measures first: plague, drought, famine. These are described as controlled interventions, attempts to manage the human population. When those fail, Enlil authorizes something far more extreme. He orders the release of the flood. The tablets do not say it rained. They say the locks were opened. They say the bolts were withdrawn. They say the waters above and below were released. This is the language of containment and release. Something was being held back, something was stored, something was sealed, and then it was deliberately unleashed. The gods themselves react with fear. They watch as the waters rise, cities vanish, humanity is erased. They did not expect this scale of destruction. Even they are overwhelmed. Afterward, they swear never to deploy it again. This is not how gods behave in myth. This is how operators behave after a catastrophic system failure. And then there is Enki. Enki cannot stop the flood, but he can warn Atrahasis. He tells him to build a sealed vessel. He gives precise instructions: dimensions, materials, sealing methods, cargo, survival protocols. Why such detail? Because someone understood exactly what was coming. When the flood ends, the gods gather around Atrahasis, offering like starving beings. They realize that destroying humanity was a mistake, not morally, operationally. They had eliminated their own support system, so they redesign humanity instead. They introduce birth limits, disease, shorter lifespans. Population control replaces annihilation. The flood becomes a last resort weapon locked away. The rituals begin. Each year, priests symbolically close the gates, seal the locks, reaffirm the promise that the flood will not be unleashed again. This is not mythology. This is institutional memory. When archaeologists first began digging in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia in the late 19th century, they expected to find temples, palaces, streets, and graves, and they did. But beneath many of the most important temples, they found something that made no immediate sense: carefully engineered underground chambers that did not fit any known religious, residential, or burial function. At Nippur, the holy city of Enlil, excavators from the University of Pennsylvania uncovered a network of sealed rooms beneath the main ziggurat. These rooms were not crude storage pits. They were built with extraordinary precision. The walls were thick. The floors were perfectly leveled. Some were lined with sheets of copper and lead. Ventilation shafts ran upward through the masonry. Multiple stone doors sealed the entrances, not just one. At the time, the archaeologists noted these features but did not understand them. The excavation reports describe them as mysterious vaults or ritual chambers because there was no obvious purpose for such elaborate construction. But when we compare these chambers to the temple inventory tablets, something startling emerges. The tablets say that the weapons of the gods were kept in sealed chambers, not in the open sanctuaries, not on display, but underground, wrapped, isolated, protected. One tablet from Nippur lists items kept in the Temple of Ninurta. It includes statues, ritual objects, and then something very different, the Tukul of Ninurta wrapped in linen kept in the sealed chamber. The Tukul of Ninurta wrapped in wool kept in the sealed chamber. The great Midu of Ninurta, which no one may touch, kept behind 3 doors. 3 doors. Why 3? Because whatever lay behind them was dangerous. Another tablet from the temple of Nergal, god of plague and war, describes annual inspection of divine weapons. On a specific day, priests must open the sealed chamber, remove the weapons, examine them for damage, and rewrap them. If any deterioration is found, the king must be informed. Why would a symbolic object deteriorate? Why would a god's weapon need maintenance? Why would the king be notified? This is how you treat military hardware, not religious metaphors. Even more chilling is an Assyrian chronicle describing an accident. During the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, priests opened a sealed weapon chamber improperly. Within days, 7 priests were dead, others were sick for months. The king ordered the chamber sealed again and declared it forbidden for a year. The text states the weapon had not been properly put to rest. That phrase appears elsewhere. Divine weapons must be deactivated. They must be made to sleep. If they are not, they can harm those nearby even without being commanded. This is not superstition. This is hazard management, and it matches what we find in the ground. At Erra, beneath the temple of the moon god Nana, archaeologists found an underground room lined with lead. At Babylon, beneath the Esagila, Marduk's great temple, excavators discovered a vault with walls several meters thick, reinforced with metal. These are not tombs. They contain no bodies. They are not treasuries. No gold was found, they were empty, but the tablets say what once lay there, weapons. Then there are the artifacts. In the British Museum there is a ceremonial mace head from the temple of Inanna at Uruk. It is made of a black stone unlike anything else from the period. It is dense, it is magnetic. Its composition does not match known Mesopotamian materials. It is perfectly balanced, engineered with precision far beyond typical Bronze Age craftsmanship. The museum labels it a cult object, but cult objects do not need to be engineered with that level of care. Another strange discovery comes from Nimrud, the Assyrian capital. 7 identical bronze cylinders were found in a temple storeroom. Each bears inscriptions identifying them as the 7 who strike together. They are hollow, sealed, never opened. Why would symbolic representations be sealed? Why would ritual objects be identical? Why would they be hidden away? Pattern repeats again and again. Text says weapons existed, temples built vaults, vaults held objects, objects were dangerous, rituals were actually safety protocols. Maintenance schedules were real and accidents had consequences. Mainstream archaeology avoids these implications. The artifacts are classified as ceremonial. The vaults are called ritual spaces. The texts are interpreted as metaphor. But none of that explains why priests died when they handled the wrong thing the wrong way. None of it explains why land was left barren after divine attacks. None of it explains why the gods themselves feared what they had unleashed. The story of the divine weapons does not end with the gods who first wielded them. In many ways, the most important part of the mystery lies in the people who came afterward, the scribes. These were not poets or storytellers in the modern sense. They were engineers of memory. Their job was not to invent, but to preserve. They copied tablets again and again, century after century, using strict methods designed to keep the words as accurate as possible. Sumerian scribal culture was obsessed with fidelity. Students trained for years learning how to copy tablets exactly. Even when they did not understand a text, they copied it word for word. This is why we still have thousands of tablets that refer to things no one in the ancient world fully understood anymore. The scribes knew these texts were old. They knew they were important. They knew they came from a time before their own, and they told us so. At the bottom of many tablets are colophons, scribal notes added after the main text. These are the ancient equivalent of footnotes, and in them the scribes often say remarkable things. One colophon on a copy of Ninurta's exploits says, "Copied from an ancient tablet found in temple ruins. The original is damaged. What could be read has been preserved for future scholars." Another reads, "This tablet is old. Its language is difficult. It has been copied as faithfully as possible." These scribes knew they were dealing with material that belonged to a distant past. They did not claim to understand everything they copied. They simply believed it was too important to lose. One of the most striking examples appears in the Erra epic. The poet Kabti Alani Marduk claims that the god Isham dictated the text to him in a dream. But then the scribe who copied it later adds a note, "The gods know if this is true. This is not blind belief. This is cautious preservation." The scribes were acting like archivists, not evangelists. They were preserving data. And the data they preserved included detailed descriptions of divine weapons, their effects, their storage, their dangers, and their history. We find the same weapons appearing in Sumerian texts, Akkadian texts, Babylonian texts, and Assyrian texts across a span of more than 1,000 years. The names change slightly. The gods change, but the weapons remain the same. Shar-Ur always flies. The seven always strike together. The Imhulu always poisons land. The flood is always released through locks. The tablet of destinies always controls everything. This kind of consistency is not typical of myth. Myths evolve. Characters change. Stories adapt to new cultures, but technical descriptions stay stable because they describe functions. A hammer is always a hammer, a blade is always a blade, a dangerous device is always dangerous. This is how technology persists through tradition. The scribes even created lists of words to explain difficult technical terms. Some of these glossaries survive. They define weapon names. They define effects. They explain obscure phrases. These are not religious explanations. They are lexical. It is as if later scribes were trying to keep track of a technical vocabulary whose original meaning was fading. Now consider this. The Sumerians themselves believed their civilization began after a catastrophe. They divided history into before the flood and after the flood. The kings who ruled before the flood are said to have lived for thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans shrink, civilization starts over, cities are rebuilt, knowledge is lost. This fits a pattern seen in many cultures, a memory of collapse. If there was a technological civilization before the flood, one that used advanced weapons, then what survived would not be machines. Machines break, power sources decay, infrastructure collapses. What survives is documentation. Clay tablets, stories, lists, instructions, and fear. The fear that certain things should never be used again. This would explain why later gods swear not to unleash the flood, why weapons are locked away. Why rituals exist to keep them dormant. The scribes may not have understood the science, but they understood the danger. This also explains why divine weapons are never improved. They are inherited, not invented. No god is ever shown creating a new system from scratch after the primordial era. They simply use what already exists. The technology is old, older than Sumer, and that is why it appears divine. To understand why the Sumerian weapon texts are so controversial, we need to step fully into the mindset of modern scholarship. For more than a century, Assyriologists, archaeologists, and historians have worked painstakingly to reconstruct the world of ancient Mesopotamia. They have learned dead languages, pieced together broken tablets, excavated cities buried for millennia, and built a coherent picture of how the first civilization functioned. Their conclusions are not guesses. They are the result of immense effort. According to this scholarly framework, the gods of Sumer were personifications of natural forces and social realities. Enlil was the storm and the authority of kingship. Enki was fresh water, fertility, and wisdom. Inanna was war and love. Ninurta was agriculture and martial strength. Their weapons were not machines but metaphors. Lightning was a weapon, floods were weapons, plagues were weapons, political power was a weapon. When the texts say Ninurta's weapon split mountains, scholars interpret this as poetic language for storms, erosion, or the king's armies. When the seven devastate cities, they see war, disease, and famine embodied in mythic figures. When Marduk's winds enter Tiamat, they see the creation of the atmosphere and the triumph of order over chaos. This interpretive model is elegant. It fits comparative mythology. It aligns with what we know of ancient religion. It avoids invoking lost civilizations or unknown technologies, but it has a problem. It does not explain the technical precision of the texts. Religious poetry is usually fluid. It changes from place to place, but Sumerian weapon descriptions are stable. They use the same words, the same sequences, the same roles over centuries. They describe weapons being activated, positioned, deployed, and deactivated. They describe hazards, contamination, quarantine, and inspection. They describe accidents. They describe storage and maintenance. Storms do not need maintenance. Lightning does not get wrapped in linen. Floods do not sit in vaults under temples. Radiance does not kill 7 priests when improperly handled. These things do not fit neatly into metaphor. Mainstream scholars often say that Mesopotamians imagined their gods as bureaucrats, so they describe divine power using administrative language. And this is true to a point. But that does not explain why the administrative language maps so closely onto the structure of real technical systems. Command and control, authorization, deployment, countermeasures, dormancy, containment, these are not poetic, they are operational. There is also the issue of physical architecture. The sealed vaults beneath temples are real. They are built with extraordinary care. Some are lined with metal, some have ventilation shafts, some are isolated from groundwater. These features are unnecessary for storing statues or scrolls. They are very necessary for storing hazardous materials. Mainstream explanations call these ritual spaces, but no one has ever demonstrated what ritual requires: lead-lined walls and multi-door access. Then there is the issue of environmental destruction. Mesopotamian texts describe areas rendered dead for generations. Archaeology confirms that some regions were suddenly abandoned and not resettled for long periods. In some places, soil shows chemical changes. Vitrified materials appear. Unusual burn layers are found. These are often explained as warfare or natural disasters, but they do not always behave like either. A fire burns everything. A flood leaves silt. A war leaves rubble. Some of these layers show intense heat without widespread fire. Others show localized destruction with sharp boundaries. These are strange signatures. None of this proves ancient superweapons. But it does challenge the idea that everything can be waved away as metaphor. The truth may lie somewhere between. The Sumerians may have witnessed catastrophic natural events so extreme that they seemed weapon-like. Meteor impacts, mega floods, volcanic eruptions, toxic gas releases. These could be remembered and ritualized as divine weapons, or they may have inherited memories from a previous culture whose technology was lost. Or the texts may be preserving multiple layers at once, myth, memory, and documentation blended together. What we do know is that the scribes believed these texts were ancient, powerful, and dangerous. They did not treat them as stories, they treated them as records, and now, after thousands of years, we are still trying to understand what they meant. What if the myths of the gods are not stories about imagination, but stories about memory? If that idea feels unsettling, it should. Because it forces us to look at the Sumerian texts not as primitive fantasies, but as fragments of something broken, distorted by time, yet stubbornly consistent. And that consistency is the key. Myths drift, memories fracture, but technical traditions, even when misunderstood, often remain strangely precise. The scribes of Mesopotamia were not inventing these stories. They were copying them over and over for more than 1,000 years. Long after Sumerian itself had become a dead language, Akkadian and Babylonian scribes still copied Sumerian weapon texts as part of their training. They treated them like sacred technical manuals. You can see this in the way they annotated their copies. They mark obscure words. They note when the original tablet was damaged. They apologize when a line is unclear. They do not rewrite, they preserve. That tells us something powerful. These texts were older than the civilizations copying them. And now we have to ask a very dangerous question. Older than what? The Sumerians themselves believed that history began after a catastrophe. Before the flood, they say, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. Civilization was different. The gods were closer. The world was not as it is now. Then the flood came and everything changed. Lifespans shortened. Knowledge was lost. Cities had to be rebuilt. The gods withdrew. This is not just one text. It is a core framework of Mesopotamian history. And it matches what the weapon stories suggest. The most powerful weapons belong to the earliest era: the flood, the Sebetu, the winds of Marduk, the Imhulu, the tablet of destinies. Later gods and kings do not invent new systems. They inherit old ones, they try to maintain them, they lock them away, they fear them. This is exactly what happens when a civilization inherits technology it can no longer fully reproduce. We have a modern analogy. Right now, there are nuclear warheads built in the 1950s that are still operational. Many of the engineers who designed them are dead. Some of the manufacturing processes no longer exist, yet the weapons remain. They are maintained, inspected, stored in hardened vaults. Access is restricted. Rituals, protocols are followed. If something goes wrong, people die. Now imagine that civilization collapses. Imagine the engineers vanish. Imagine centuries pass. All that remains are vaults, manuals, and stories about terrible power that must not be used. That is what Sumerian religion looks like. The gods are not inventors, they are operators. They do not create weapons, they command them. They argue over authorization, they fear misuse, they regret deployment. They lock systems down. They establish treaties not to use certain weapons again. This is not the psychology of storm gods. This is the psychology of custodians of dangerous technology. And the strangest part of all is that the texts admit it. Again and again, gods are shown to be frightened by their own weapons. During the flood, they cower. After Erra unleashes the seven, he is rebuked. After Ninurta uses his arsenal, he must ritually deactivate it. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, the other gods ask him how he made such weapons. This is not divine omnipotence. This is asymmetrical access to power. Some beings know more than others. Some have better weapons. Some have control systems, some do not. Now consider the Anzu story again. The tablet of destinies is stolen, everything fails. That is exactly what happens when a central control node is compromised. The gods cannot act, weapons do not work, authority collapses, until physical access to the control device is restored. That is not myth logic, that is systems logic, and systems logic does not belong to Bronze Age agriculture. It belongs to technological civilization. The Anunnaki, their name alone carries the weight of something ancient and difficult to define. In Sumerian, Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came, or the princely offspring of Anu. In the earliest texts, they are not vague spirits. They are described as beings who arrive, establish order, assign territories, build cities, and rule. They sit in councils, they issue decrees, they maintain records, they command weapons, they are administrators of the world. This is not how spirits behave. This is how governors behave, and now we must look at something that most people never notice when reading these tablets. The gods do not seem all-powerful. They do not seem all-knowing. They argue, they disagree, they fail, they panic, they make mistakes. They lose control of their own systems. They need help. In the flood story, Enlil authorizes the flood, but Enki subverts him. In the Anzu story, Enlil is helpless when the tablet of destinies is stolen. In the Erra epic, Erra unleashes destruction that frightens even the other gods. In the Tiamat story, the older gods are terrified and powerless until Marduk appears with superior weapons. This is not theology, this is hierarchy. Some beings have better technology than others, some have control over systems, some do not. Now look at the way humans appear in these stories. Humans are not created as spiritual beings, they are created as workers. The gods complain about labor. They are tired of digging canals, they are tired of maintaining the land. They create humans to do the work. This is not metaphor. This is a labor model. The Atrahasis epic is explicit. The lesser gods rebel because they are overworked. They threaten violence. The higher gods solve the problem by creating humans to take over the labor. Humans are manufactured from clay mixed with divine substance. They are assigned to maintain the world. That is not how creation myths usually sound. That is how industrial societies solve labor shortages. And then comes something even stranger. Humans are noisy, too noisy. Their population grows, their cities expand. Their activity interferes with the gods' rest. The gods do not describe this as moral failure, they describe it as operational interference. Humanity is disrupting their system, so they try population control, first plague, then drought, then famine. When those fail, they escalate, the flood. This is not divine wrath. This is crisis management. Now connect this to the weapons. Why do the gods need weapons against humans? Because humans are not powerless. Humans build cities. Humans multiply. Humans change the landscape. They have become a factor in the system, so the gods have contingency plans. The seven, the flood, the winds, the radiance, these are not punishments, they are control mechanisms. And this leads to the most unsettling idea of all. What if the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings at all? What if they were a technologically advanced civilization that arrived on Earth long before Sumer? What if they built infrastructure, created a labor force, and then lost control of their systems? What if the flood was not divine judgment, but a catastrophic attempt to reset a system that had become unstable? The texts never say the gods created the earth. They say they arrived. They say they divided it. They say they took control of it. They say they built cities on it. They say they extracted resources from it. They say they fought wars on it. This is colonization language. The Sumerians did not worship abstract gods of the sky. They worshipped rulers. Now look again at the temples. Why are the weapons stored under them? Because temples are not just religious centers. They are administrative centers. They are power hubs. They are where the gods reside on earth. They are interfaces between humans and the Anunnaki, and beneath them are vaults, control systems, weapons. Emergency measures. The Sumerians treated these places with extreme caution. They knew some things were not meant to be touched. They knew some knowledge was dangerous. They knew some power could kill. This is why they surrounded divine weapons with ritual. Ritual is how you encode safety protocols in a pre-scientific society. You do not tell people about radiation. You tell them the god will strike them dead. The result is the same. They keep their distance, and it works. Thousands of years, these systems remained dormant, but the memory remained. Now think about the myths again. They are not stories about magic. They are stories about technology so advanced it looks like magic. Autonomous weapons, energy beams, poisonous winds, planet-altering floods, central command tablets, defense grids, sealed vaults, maintenance protocols. If this sounds like science fiction, remember something important. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That is not a modern idea. That is a reality of human perception. Now we are going to move into something even more delicate. Why did all of this disappear? Why did humanity fall back into the Bronze Age? Why was this knowledge lost? And why do the gods seem to withdraw from the world after the flood? And so we turn toward the collapse, the quiet, terrifying moment when the age of the Anunnaki faded and the age of humanity truly began. The Sumerian tablets do not describe a golden age that ended peacefully. They describe something much more unsettling, a world that became unstable, a system that could no longer be controlled, a hierarchy that fractured, weapons that became too dangerous to use, gods that began to fear their own power. After the flood, something changes in every text. Before the flood, the gods walk openly among humans. They build cities, they choose kings, they rule directly. Their weapons are active. Their presence is constant. After the flood, they withdraw. They still exist. They still command, but they no longer appear in the same way. They rule through priests, through kings, through tablets, not through direct presence. This is not just theology. This is administrative decentralization, a powerful ruling system stepping back, leaving behind infrastructure and rules. Why? Because something broke. The flood was not just a disaster for humans. It was a disaster for the gods. They lost their workforce. They lost their cities. They lost their operational stability. And perhaps they lost control of their most dangerous systems. This is where the tone of the texts changes. Earlier, gods use weapons freely. Later, they fear them. Earlier, wars between gods reshape the world. Later, divine wars are remembered but never repeated. Earlier, the seven are unleashed. Later, rituals are performed to keep them asleep. Earlier, the flood is deployed. Later, vows are sworn never to release it again. This is the behavior of a civilization that has realized its technology is too powerful. Modern humans know this feeling. We have nuclear weapons, we built them, we tested them, we saw what they do, and now we fear them. We lock them in silos, we make treaties, we invent rituals of inspection, we pray they are never used again. This is exactly what the Mesopotamian gods do, and that is the most disturbing mirror of all. Now consider something else. The Sumerians never say the Anunnaki left Earth. They say they ascended. They returned to heaven. They withdrew. Those words are ambiguous. They could mean spiritual ascent, or they could mean departure. The texts say the gods had celestial boats, flying chariots, vehicles that could move between heaven and earth. These are not metaphors in Sumerian, they are vehicles. The same word used for ships is used for divine craft. The gods travel, they do not teleport, they ride. If the Anunnaki were not supernatural but technological beings, then heaven was not a mystical realm. It was orbit, it was the sky, it was space, and Earth was their outpost. Now think about what happened after the flood. Human civilization restarts, but something is missing. The gods no longer build cities. Humans do. The gods no longer operate machines. Humans maintain what remains. The gods no longer directly intervene with weapons. Humans fight with swords. The age of advanced systems is over. What remains is ritual memory and scattered relics and sealed vaults. This explains why later kings try to claim divine weapons but never truly use them. They wear ceremonial maces. They inscribe that they carry the bow of Marduk, but their wars are fought with bronze and blood. The real weapons are locked away. Too dangerous, too unstable, too poorly understood, so the gods recede, and humans inherit a broken world. A world shaped by technology they no longer control. Flooded plains, altered landscapes, ruined cities, forbidden zones, legends of destruction. Now we are going to confront the most dangerous idea of all. What if modern archaeology has already found traces of this lost age but misinterpreted them? What if the vitrified ruins, the strange isotopes, the abandoned cities, and the sealed chambers are not just curiosities, but the fingerprints of a forgotten catastrophe? Before we continue, there is something important to keep clear in your mind as you listen to this story unfold. What we are doing here is not declaring that ancient gods were aliens or that nuclear weapons existed in 3000 BC. What we are doing is something much more interesting and much more honest. We are following the patterns inside the texts themselves and asking why they were written the way they were written. We are exploring how myth, memory, and technical description can blend together when knowledge survives catastrophe. With that grounded, we continue. After the flood, the world of the Sumerians looks strangely haunted. The cities rise again. The canals are dug again. Temples are rebuilt. Kings rule. Life goes on, but beneath it all runs a deep current of fear of forces that once reshaped the world and might do so again. The Sumerians believed they lived in the shadow of something older. That belief is everywhere in their writing. They talk about a time when the gods were more present, when divine weapons were active, when kings lived for thousands of years, when the world was different. That era is always placed before the flood. After the flood, everything becomes smaller. Human lifespans shrink, cities become fragile, the gods become distant. And most importantly, the weapons go silent, not destroyed, not erased, just sealed. This is one of the most striking features of Mesopotamian religion. Their most powerful weapons are not used in later history. They are locked away and ritually restrained. Every year, ceremonies are performed to keep them dormant. You don't do that for metaphors. You do that for things that scare you. Now think about something modern. In our world, nuclear weapons are surrounded by ritual. Not religious ritual, but bureaucratic ritual. Codes, two-person rules, authentication systems. Sealed bunkers, inspection schedules, treaties, agreements, oaths, all of it exists for one reason, because the weapons are too powerful to be trusted to emotion. The Sumerians did the same thing, but in the only way their culture knew how. They turned safety protocols into religion. They turned containment into ritual. They turned technological fear into divine law. This explains something that has puzzled scholars for generations, why Mesopotamian religion is so obsessed with order, boundaries, and cosmic rules. The gods are not just beings, they are regulators. They enforce the laws that keep the world functioning. The gods fear chaos not because it is immoral, but because it is dangerous. Chaos is what happens when systems fail. The flood was chaos. The seven were chaos. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies was chaos. And after those events, everything in Mesopotamian culture becomes focused on preventing another collapse. That is why the gods become judges instead of warriors. That is why temples become centers of record keeping. That is why priests become more important than heroes. That is why rituals multiply. This is what societies do after surviving catastrophe. They try to stabilize. They try to remember what went wrong. They try to keep it from happening again. Now let's look at archaeology through that lens. When archaeologists dig into Mesopotamian ruins, they find layers of destruction. Some are from war, some are from fire, some are from flood, but some are strange. At sites like Erra, Kish, and Shirapak, there are thick flood layers, but above and below them we see something else: sudden abandonment, cities emptied, entire populations gone. These are not slow declines, they are sudden, and in some places the destruction is uneven. One area is wiped out, another survives. That suggests targeted events, not gradual environmental change. Mainstream archaeology explains these as local floods, invasions, or political collapse. Those explanations are often reasonable, but when you place them next to the flood text, something becomes eerie. The tablets say the flood was aimed at cities, at cult centers, at human population clusters. And archaeology finds exactly that pattern: cities buried, countryside less affected. That does not prove the flood was a weapon, but it shows the story matches the data more closely than many people realize. Now look at vitrification. In parts of the ancient Near East, archaeologists have found stone and mud brick that were melted into glassy material. That takes temperatures far higher than normal fires. Mainstream explanations include intense burning during sieges or lightning strikes. Those can create small vitrified patches. But at some sites, the vitrification is widespread and uneven, not consistent with a single massive fire. Again, this does not prove advanced weapons, but it does mean that extreme heat was present in ways not fully explained. Now remember what Ninurta's mitu does. It turns ground to glass. That doesn't mean the mitu was a laser or a bomb. It means the people who wrote that text had seen something that left that kind of trace, and they remembered it. This is where myth and memory blur. People who survived disasters often mythologize them. Volcanic eruptions become dragon battles, tsunamis become flood gods, meteor impacts become heavenly wars, but the details remain: heat, light, shockwaves, darkness, suffocation, after effects. The Mesopotamian texts preserve all of those. Now think about the Sebitu, 7 forces that strike together. Modern readers imagine demons, but ancient people would have experienced disasters as multiple simultaneous effects: an impact, a firestorm, a dust cloud, toxic air, darkness, long-term contamination, illness. They count them, they name them, they turn them into 7 beings, because that is how humans process overwhelming events. This is not fantasy, this is trauma encoding. Now we come to the most important realization of all. Even if every single divine weapon was metaphorical, the fear was real. The rituals were real, the sealed chambers were real, the maintenance protocols were real. The belief that something terrible had once happened was real, and the desire to never let it happen again shaped an entire civilization. That is the true power of these texts. They are not just stories about gods. They are a record of humanity living in the shadow of catastrophe, a catastrophe so large that it became myth. A catastrophe so frightening that it became sacred. A catastrophe so poorly understood that it became divine. This is how knowledge survives when science dies. It becomes religion. And this is where the Anunnaki fit. Whether they were gods, kings, or something else, they represent the memory of a ruling class that existed before the flood. After the flood, they become distant, they become abstract, they become law, they become heaven, but their weapons remain sleeping, waiting, feared. And now we reach the heart of the fear that pulses beneath every one of these ancient texts. Not fear of gods, fear of what gods can do, or more precisely, fear of what once happened. Because cultures do not invent terror out of nothing, they remember it, they reshape it. They encode it into stories, rituals, taboos, and law. And when a trauma is too large to be held in history, it becomes myth. That is what the Sumerian record feels like, a civilization haunted by something that almost destroyed everything. Look again at how they speak about the flood, not as a miracle, not as a moral lesson, but as a deployment, a decision, a system release. And look at how they speak about weapons. Not as toys, not as symbols, but as hazards, things that must be sealed, appeased, inspected, kept dormant. These are not the instincts of people imagining fairy tales. These are the instincts of people who have inherited dangerous tools. Now imagine being a Sumerian priest. You live in a city built on the ruins of something older. Your temple stands above sealed chambers. Your texts tell you that if certain things are disturbed, the land will die. You perform rituals not to please gods, but to keep something asleep. You do not know how the weapons work, but you know they can kill, so you obey. That is how technological taboos are born. We do the same thing today. We do not let children touch exposed wiring. We do not allow untrained people near reactors. We do not open sealed containers marked radioactive. We do not always understand the physics, but we trust the rules. Now take that forward 4,000 years. Remove science. Remove engineering. All that remains are stories. Do not open the vault. Do not touch the weapon. Do not break the seal. Do not wake what sleeps. That is Mesopotamian religion. Now consider one more pattern. The gods are obsessed with control, the tablet of destinies, the me, the divine laws. These are not moral codes. They are system parameters. Who can command what? Who can activate which weapons? Who has authorization? When Anzu steals the tablet, everything fails. When it is restored, order returns. That is not symbolism. That is infrastructure. Now let's talk about time. The Sumerian king list says that before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become normal. This has been dismissed as mythological exaggeration. But what if it is something else? What if kings before the flood were not human? What if they were Anunnaki, long-lived beings, technological beings, beings who could survive far longer than humans? After the flood, they withdraw. Human kings replace them. The king list is not wrong. It is telling you that something changed, and it marks that change with the flood. Everything changes with the flood. The gods step back, weapons go dormant, humanity is on its own. Now, why would advanced beings abandon Earth? The texts hint at exhaustion, at overpopulation, at system strain, at conflict among the gods, at disasters they could not fully control. Perhaps Earth became too unstable. Perhaps their own weapons made the planet dangerous. Perhaps they left behind only what could not be safely moved. Vaults, weapons, systems, and rules, and humans were left to inherit a broken machine. This is speculative, but it matches the pattern. The Anunnaki go to heaven, humans inherit the earth. The weapons remain, but they are sealed. The gods become distant voices instead of rulers. Now we are going to approach the most uncomfortable thought of all. What if we are not the first civilization to face the danger of its own technology? What if the flood stories are not just about water, but about a reset, a collapse, a moment when an advanced system fell apart and the survivors had to start again? That is the real reason these texts matter. Not because they prove aliens or ancient nukes, but because they show how civilizations remember catastrophe. And that brings us to the most haunting question. What if the greatest lesson in the clay is not about gods, but about us? Because we are doing the same thing now. We are building weapons that can end the world. We are creating autonomous systems. We are losing control of complexity. We are writing rules, treaties, and rituals to keep our creations from destroying us. We are becoming the gods of our own myths. And one day, if we fail, someone else may find our ruins. They will find sealed vaults, radiation warnings, stories about fire from the sky, and they will turn them into legends, just like the Sumerians did. What makes the Sumerian story so haunting is not how different it is from us, but how familiar it feels once you truly listen to it. Because at its core, the myth of the Anunnaki is not about gods. It is about a civilization that reached a level of power it did not fully control, and that is the oldest story of all. Long before modern science, long before machines and electricity, people were already telling stories about forces that were too great, about tools that should never be used lightly, about knowledge that brings destruction as easily as it brings creation. But the Sumerian version is different. It does not talk about temptation. It talks about management. It does not talk about sin. It talks about noise, overcrowding, and instability. It does not talk about evil. It talks about systems failing. The gods are not angry because humans are wicked. They are angry because humans are disruptive. This is one of the strangest aspects of the Atrahasis epic. Humanity is not punished for immorality. Humanity is punished for being too numerous, too loud, too active, too difficult to manage. This is not the psychology of religion. This is the psychology of engineers. Now imagine a world run by a powerful group that has created a self-sustaining system. Cities, canals, farms, workers, and infrastructure. That system grows, it becomes noisy, it becomes unpredictable. It starts interfering with the operators, so they apply pressure, then more pressure, then reset. That is what the flood is. Now look at Erra. Erra is not a villain. He is a god assigned to destruction. He grows restless. He wants to use the weapons. He convinces Marduk to step away. He unleashes the seven. The result is devastation. The other gods panic. Erra is eventually forced to stop. This is not a story about a demon. This is a story about a military commander who used weapons irresponsibly, and the result was nearly catastrophic. Now look at Ninurta. He is a war god but also a hero. Yet after he uses his weapons, he must undergo rituals. His weapons must be put to sleep. The land must be purified. This is post-conflict cleanup. This is decontamination. This is resetting dangerous systems. These texts do not feel like imagination, they feel like legacy. Now consider how the Sumerians treated knowledge. They believed certain tablets were too dangerous to read, certain names too dangerous to speak, certain rituals too dangerous to perform. That is exactly how we treat classified information. Nuclear launch codes, bioweapon research, AI control systems. We do not let everyone access them, we seal them. We restrict them, we ritualize their handling. This is the same instinct, the same fear. Now ask yourself, if a civilization had once nearly destroyed itself, what would its survivors teach their children? They would not teach them how to build the weapons again, they would teach them how to avoid them. They would turn warnings into gods, they would turn safety protocols into commandments, they would turn catastrophic memory into sacred law. That is what Sumerian religion looks like. Now we come to the final realization for this section. Even if the Anunnaki were purely symbolic, they symbolize something real. They symbolize a lost age of power, a time before the flood, a time before the world was broken, a time when forces existed that later generations could no longer control. And that is why the gods are so distant. They are not physically gone, they are psychologically gone. They belong to an age humanity no longer understands. We live in the ruins of their stories. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the ancient tablets. Not that gods ruled the world, but that something did, something powerful, something dangerous, something that left scars on the earth and in human memory. And those scars became myth. And now, as the threads of this ancient story continue to tighten, something remarkable begins to happen. The myths stop feeling ancient. They start feeling modern. Because what the Sumerians were really wrestling with was not gods, it was the relationship between intelligence, power, and survival. And that is our story now. Let us return for a moment to the Anunnaki themselves. In the earliest tablets, they are not spiritual beings. They are described as a class, a ruling group. They have hierarchy. Anu is at the top, Enlil manages Earth. Enki handles technology and knowledge. Ninurta commands weapons. Erra handles destruction. Shamus handles observation. Inanna handles influence and social control. This is not a pantheon. This is an organization, and humans sit at the bottom of it, created to work, designed to maintain, expected to obey. Now imagine what happens when that system breaks. The workforce grows too large, the infrastructure strains, the noise increases, the managers lose patience. They deploy control systems, they fail, they escalate, the flood. This is a familiar pattern. It is what happens when centralized power and uncontrolled growth collide. After the flood, the gods no longer directly manage humanity. They create kings instead. They decentralize control. They move from direct rule to proxy rule. This is empire behavior, and when empires fall, their technology is often lost. The Romans built aqueducts that later generations could not repair. The Greeks built machines that medieval Europe could not reproduce. The Anunnaki built something even greater. And when it collapsed, all that remained were fragments, stories, rituals, sealed vaults, and fear. Now think about the seven. Why seven? Because seven was sacred, but also because seven is manageable. A small number of coordinated systems, enough to cover all directions, front, back, sides, above, below, atmosphere, ground. Seven is not mystical, it is tactical, and those seven appear everywhere. The Sebitu, Humbaba's terrors, Marduk's winds, they are the same pattern repeated. Different stories, same structure. That means the pattern is older than the stories. Now ask yourself something. Why would ancient writers keep preserving stories about weapons they could no longer use? Why not just forget them? Because they were afraid. They were afraid that someone might rediscover them. They were afraid that something might awaken. They were afraid of repeating the disaster. And fear preserves memory better than anything else. Now we step into something deeply unsettling. What if some of those weapons were never destroyed? What if some of them are still buried, not active, not functioning, but still there? We know that Mesopotamia was covered in sealed chambers. We know that many were looted. We know that many were destroyed. But we also know that vast areas have never been excavated. We know that modern wars have made archaeology impossible in many regions. We know that ancient texts say certain places must not be disturbed. And we know that ancient people believed terrible things slept under the ground. That belief did not come from nowhere. Now, to be clear, this does not mean there are doomsday machines buried in a rock, but it does mean something important. The Sumerians believed that dangerous remnants of the old world still existed, and they built their religion around keeping them quiet. Now look at our world. We are burying nuclear waste in sealed vaults. We are marking them with warnings meant to last 10,000 years. We are trying to tell the future, do not dig here, do not open this, it will kill you. Now imagine that civilization collapses. Imagine those vaults are found by people who no longer understand radiation. They will invent stories, they will invent gods, they will invent curses, and those stories will be the only thing standing between them and disaster. This is exactly what Sumerian religion looks like. A warning system built from myth, a memory system built from fear, a culture trying to survive what it does not fully understand. This is why the Anunnaki feel so strange. They are not gods, they are echoes. Echoes of a time when something much greater than humanity controlled the world. And when that control was lost, the Sumerians lived in the aftermath, just like we might someday. And now the story moves into its most unsettling phase, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The Sumerians did not live in a world of innocent myth. They lived in a world that had already been broken. They believed that before their time, something catastrophic had happened, something so vast that it divided all of history into two ages, before the flood and after the flood. And in every version of that story, the same truth appears again and again. The flood was not an accident. It was not random. It was not natural. It was released. That detail alone changes everything. Because natural disasters are not released. Weapons are. Now look at what happens after that release. Human civilization does not resume normally. It restarts smaller, weaker, and afraid. Cities are rebuilt, but they never reach the scale or confidence of what the gods once built. Lifespans short, knowledge fragments, technology regresses, and above all, fear becomes institutionalized. The Sumerians do not pray for abundance first. They pray for protection. They do not ask the gods for prosperity. They ask the gods not to destroy them. That is a trauma response. A culture that has seen annihilation organizes itself around not letting it happen again. Now look at their gods through that lens. The gods are not loving creators. They are dangerous custodians of power. Enlil is feared, not adored. Erra is dreaded. Nergal is invoked to stay away. Even Marduk, the hero, is dangerous. The Sumerian gods are not comforting. They are nuclear. And that is not a metaphor. That is how they behave. They hold the power to erase entire cities. They use weapons that cause sickness, darkness, and long-term land death. They argue about when to deploy them. They regret using them. They seal them away afterward. This is exactly how modern humans talk about weapons of mass destruction, and that is not coincidence. It is pattern. Now think about something else. The Sumerians did not believe they invented civilization. They believed it was given to them. Writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, architecture, all were gifts from the gods. Why? Because they inherited a system they did not fully understand. We do the same thing when we inherit technology from a fallen empire. Imagine someone discovering a modern data center in 1,000 years. They would not know how it was built. They would not know how it worked. They would call it divine. Now imagine a Bronze Age civilization inheriting ruins, systems, and knowledge from a much older age. They would do exactly what the Sumerians did. They would call the builders gods. They would preserve what they could. They would ritualize what they could not. They would fear what they did not understand. This explains the strangest feature of Sumerian religion, why their gods feel more like supervisors than creators, because they were not the beginning. They were the managers of what remained. Now let's return to the Anunnaki one last time. They are called those who from heaven to earth came. Not those who made the earth, not those who formed the universe. Those who came, they arrive, they take control. They assign roles, they extract labor, they build cities, they fight wars, they deploy weapons, and then something goes wrong. The flood, the wars, the internal conflicts, the loss of control. And then they withdraw. They do not die. They do not disappear. They step back. They become distant. They become heaven, and humanity is left with their leftovers, their cities, their systems, their warnings, their locked vaults, their terrifying memories. This is not fantasy. This is what happens after collapse. The Sumerians lived after a collapse they could not explain, and they encoded that collapse into myth. Now look at us. We are building systems so complex that even we do not fully understand them. We are creating machines that think, weapons that choose, networks that control infrastructure. We are pushing toward a level of power that no civilization before us has held. And we are afraid. We write treaties. We create kill switches. We bury waste. We design rituals of safety. We are becoming the Sumerian gods, and one day if we fail, someone will inherit our ruins. They will find sealed bunkers, radiation symbols, stories of fire from the sky. and they will turn them into gods, just like the Sumerians did. And that is the deepest truth hidden in the clay. Not that gods once ruled the world, but that something once did, something powerful, something dangerous, something that fell, and left behind a frightened humanity trying to remember what happened. And now, as we move even deeper into this ancient memory, we arrive at the point where the past and the present begin to overlap in a way that feels almost uncomfortable. Because once you start to see the pattern, you realize something profound. The Sumerians were not merely telling stories about gods. They were preserving the memory of a world that had been transformed by power it could no longer control. Every civilization carries a myth of destruction, but the Sumerian myth is different. It is not vague. It is not symbolic in the way later traditions become. It is technical. It is procedural. It is filled with the language of systems, deployment, containment, and failure. And that is what makes it so haunting. The flood was not just water. The seven were not just demons. The winds were not just weather. The tablet of destinies was not just a symbol. They were parts of a system, and that system broke. Imagine standing in ancient Sumer, watching the sky darken, the ground shake, the waters rise, and the land itself become poisoned. Imagine survivors emerging into a world where cities were gone, fields were ruined, and the gods themselves seemed frightened. That trauma does not fade. It becomes the foundation of religion. And so the Sumerians built their entire worldview around one simple goal: do not let this happen again. That is why order, law, ritual, and divine authority are so important in Mesopotamian culture. They are not about morality. They are about stability. They are about keeping the system from collapsing again. The gods become less like beings and more like regulators. They enforce the cosmic rules. They oversee boundaries. They punish disruptions, because disruption once meant annihilation. Now look at the Anunnaki through this lens. They are not spiritual archetypes. They are custodians of a dangerous inheritance. They inherited weapons, systems, and knowledge from a time before the flood. They do not create them. They manage them. They fight over them. They lose control of them. They fear them. That is why even gods can be overruled by the tablet of destinies. That is why Erra can unleash devastation without the consent of others. That is why Anzu can paralyze heaven by stealing a single object. This is not divine omnipotence. This is technological dependency, and dependency is fragile. Now consider something else the Sumerians tell us. They say the gods themselves came from somewhere else. Anu rules from heaven, Enlil governs the earth, Enki dwells in the abyss. The gods are not all from the same place. They have different domains, different origins, different roles. That is not mythology. That is organization. Now imagine a civilization that colonized Earth long before recorded history. Imagine it built infrastructure, created a workforce, and governed through advanced systems. Imagine it experienced internal conflict, overpopulation, and environmental strain. Imagine it deployed weapons to control those problems. Imagine one of those deployments went too far, the flood. After that, imagine the civilization withdrew, leaving behind fragments, systems, and warnings. Humans would inherit the ruins. They would not know how to run them, but they would know they were dangerous, so they would create gods, they would create rituals, they would create taboos, they would turn technology into theology. And that is exactly what the Sumerian world looks like. Now let us look again at the temples. These were not just places of worship. They were administrative centers, record-keeping facilities, treasuries, control hubs, and beneath them were sealed chambers. Why beneath temples? Because temples were the safest places. They were guarded, respected, untouchable, the perfect place to hide something that must never be disturbed. And what did they store? Weapons of the gods, winds, radiance, maces, nets, things that required purification to approach, things that killed people when mishandled. things that had to be inspected for deterioration. That is not how you store symbolic objects. That is how you store hazardous equipment. Now remember the Assyrian account where 7 priests died after improper handling of a divine weapon. They were not struck by lightning. They became ill. They suffered. They died over days. That is not divine wrath. That is exposure. Now think about how the gods talk about these weapons. They do not say, "Let my power strike you." They say, "I will send forth my weapon." The weapon is separate, it is an object, it is a system. It can be activated, deactivated, stored, moved, recalled. This is not mythic language, this is operational language, and this is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because the Sumerians did not just fear their gods, they feared their gods' tools. Now imagine if our civilization collapsed and someone found a nuclear missile silo. They would not know what it was, but they would know it was dangerous. They would build a temple over it. They would tell stories about a fire god beneath the earth. They would invent rituals to keep it asleep, and they would be right to do so. This is exactly what the Sumerians did. Now let us talk about the silence. After a certain point in Mesopotamian history, the great divine weapons stop appearing. No more floods, no more 7, no more winds that swallow cities. The gods become political. They give laws, they give kingship, they give omens, but the era of annihilation ends. Why? Because the weapons were locked away, and no one dared to use them again. That is not mythology, that is restraint. That is what happens after you nearly destroy everything. And that brings us to the deepest layer of this story. The Sumerians were not warning us about gods, they were warning us about ourselves, about what happens when power exceeds wisdom, about what happens when systems become too complex to control, about what happens when weapons become too destructive to use. They encoded that warning into the oldest writing on Earth. And now, thousands of years later, we stand at the same edge. We have autonomous weapons, we have climate-altering technology, we have civilization-ending power, and we are writing our own rituals, our own treaties, our own safety protocols, just like the Sumerians did. One day, if we fail, someone else will read our ruins. They will not understand our science. They will not know our machines. They will turn them into gods. And they will tell stories about a time when fire fell from the sky and the world nearly ended, just like the Sumerians did. Hello guys, and now we arrive at the final part of this journey. Everything we have explored, the Anunnaki, the divine weapons, the flood, the sealed vaults, the 7, the tablets of destiny, it all leads to one quiet, powerful truth. The Sumerians were not telling fairy tales. They were preserving memory, not perfect memory, not scientific memory, but cultural memory, the kind that survives when everything else is lost. They lived in a world that believed it had already been destroyed once, and when you believe that, everything changes. The Sumerians did not ask, "Why did the gods make us?" They asked, "How do we survive them?" They did not pray for miracles, they prayed for restraint. They did not worship power, they feared it, and that fear shaped the first civilization on Earth. When they wrote about the Anunnaki, they were not describing invisible spirits floating in clouds. They were describing rulers, beings who arrived, organized the world, controlled technology, and then lost control of it. Beings who argued, who failed, who feared their own weapons, who withdrew after catastrophe. Whether those beings were advanced humans, a lost civilization, or something else entirely is less important than what they represent, a warning. A warning that power without wisdom leads to destruction. A warning that technology can outgrow the ability to control it. A warning that even gods can make mistakes. The flood was not just water, it was what happens when a system resets itself by force. The 7 were not just demons, they were what happens when destruction becomes automated. The Tablet of Destinies was not just a myth, it was what happens when control is centralized in one place. And the sealed chambers beneath the temples, they were not just ritual spaces. They were humanity's attempt to keep something dangerous asleep. The Sumerians lived in the ruins of a forgotten age. They inherited knowledge they did not fully understand. They preserved warnings they could not explain. They turned technology into theology, and in doing so they left us the oldest message ever written in clay. Be careful what you build, because once it exists, it may outlive you, and if it is powerful enough, it may become your god. So the next time you hear about ancient gods throwing lightning, commanding storms, unleashing plagues, and flooding the world, remember this: those stories may be the echoes of something real. Not supernatural, but catastrophic; not divine, but technological; not fantasy, but memory. And just like the Sumerians, we are now standing at the edge of power that can either create a golden age or end everything. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into ancient clay and forgotten fears. If this story made you think, if it made you see ancient myths in a new way, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with someone who loves deep mysteries. And most importantly, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Until next time, stay curious.